My name is Bonnie Loomis, and I'm South Carolina Managing Director with E4 Carolinas, and we welcome you to the 2021 South Carolina Clean Energy Spring Policy Conversation. Have a couple of opening comments myself, and I'm then going to turn this over to Hamilton Davis, a member of our South Carolina Clean Energy Industries Task Force, who will be moderating today and will introduce our speakers. But before I do that, I wanted to first of all say a really big thank you, obviously, to our moderator and our speakers, but most importantly, I wanted to thank everyone who registered for this event and bared with us as we were going through the process of putting the event together. Some of you may be aware that we initially planned this as a series of conversations similar to a multi-part policy forum that we held in the fall of last year, soon after the South Carolina Clean Energy Business Alliance joined E4 Carolinas, and we stood up the South Carolina Clean Energy Industries Task Force within E4 Carolinas. As we went through the weeks of working toward this event, it became clear that it was best from really a market perspective, with a lot of regulatory activity going on, continuing legislative activity in both South and North Carolina, that we would be best served by really focusing in rather than getting as broad as we initially planned. So we then decided to focus in, consolidate this into what is now a one session event. So this is our only session of the Spring Policy Forum, which in the past, last year had been a multi-part series, and then in 2019 had been a multi-hour program, lasting about 4 or 5 hours, if I recall correctly. So we are grateful to y'all for bearing with us as we evolved through the planning process with this event. And so in that regard, just a little background on the reason we felt this was the right conversation to have now. And actually, I'll share, hopefully Emily is comfortable with me sharing this. I think that she is. Emily sits in North Carolina. Emily Felt with Duke Energy is a member of our Clean Energy Industries Task Force as well. And Emily had been very active in clean energy policy as a part of the Duke Energy team, and then had a couple of different roles where her focus was not quite as specific in the Carolinas, and then came into a new role where her focus is very specific to South Carolina. And so as we were gathering for our first planning call, Emily posed the question to me and Hamilton primarily, and Weston Adams, who is our task force co-chair as well. Weston's with Nelson Mullins. Are we at a place in South Carolina where we have to talk about whether we're moving to clean energy or not anymore? And it was a really good question because, 10 years ago, we were having to talk about that in South Carolina. Are we or are we not moving to a clean energy environment? And Hamilton and I both felt, and Weston as well, that we didn't need to have that conversation because of activity that's taken place at the legislature, because of activity taking place at the Public Service Commission, because of activity, most importantly, because of activity taking place within the utilities and within the market, that no, the answer is yes, we are having a clean energy transition in South Carolina. And that begs a lot of questions. And one of the questions specifically revolves around, are we structured from a policy perspective, from a statutory and a regulatory perspective, are we structured to really support the retirement of coal generation? We know that our power generation providers are moving in that direction. And what are the regulatory or statutory or market challenges that it presents? So that is the genesis of today's conversation, which is titled South Carolina's Clean Energy Transition. Are the right policies in place to support the retirement of coal generation. And we really appreciate everyone being a part of this conversation with us today. Before I turn it over to Hamilton, I have a couple of housekeeping items that I would like to run through. I think all of us are extremely familiar and quite adept at operating in this virtual meeting capacity now. But I will repeat, if you are not actively speaking, will you please keep your microphone on mute to eliminate background noise? You are welcome to either have your video on or have your video off. You know, it's your preference. It's great for the speakers to be able to see faces as they're speaking. But if you're having bandwidth issues, turning off your video is perhaps the first step to making sure that you're receiving your stream of data as best possible. We invite you to chat questions during the program. There is a designated Q&A period at the end, and Hamilton will then let you know that we've reached that point in the program and open up for questions. Hamilton is also real good, as are the speakers, because all of them have participated with E4 Carolinas before, and I know this, are real good about keeping an eye on the chat as well. And so if there's a question posed that they're able to respond to during their comments, they will certainly do that. And the last question I have of you is really, there's two, and it is, where are you joining us from today? From a geographic perspective, I'm just interested in understanding how broad our reach is right now. And secondly, when do you anticipate you or your organization being comfortable with a return to in-person activities, in-person gatherings, not just in-person office work, but in-person gatherings? We are in the process, like everybody, of working to figure out as an organization how we transition through the next 6 are curious what people are thinking at this time. We certainly know everything is fluid, subject to change. We can't know today what tomorrow is going to look like, but it's just a point in time snapshot for us to understand when you may be comfortable traveling again to a group gathering. And one last thing I will say is the reason we're asking that question is because we are anticipating holding our 2021 South Carolina Clean Energy Conference in early December in both an in-person and online opportunity fashion. I will later chat the dates of that event and our upcoming South Carolina legislative regulatory update so that you can keep an eye on those. But back to what I asked of you, if you don't mind letting us know where you're joining us from and when you think you'll be comfortable or your organization will be comfortable with you attending an in-person gathering, we'd appreciate that. And now I will hand it over to you, Hamilton. Hamilton is Director of Regulatory Affairs for Southern Current and has been a stalwart in the clean energy conversation in South Carolina for over a decade. So I'm excited that Hamilton agreed to take the task of moderating today. Thank you so much, Hamilton. I'm going to go on mute.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie, for that introduction, and thank all of you for joining us today. I certainly anticipate this is going to be an interesting and enlightening discussion, as well as wide-ranging. So, got a lot to cover. I'm not going to spend much time on my introduction before we dive right in, but I do just want to reiterate what Bonnie said. You know, South Carolina has made significant strides in the last 6 years, starting in 2015 with the passage of Act 236, and then in 2019 with the passage of Act 62. Both of those policies were unanimously supported by the South Carolina General Assembly, which is fairly amazing given the different perspectives that show up when we have that type of policy negotiation. And they've resulted in significant deployment of customer-sited generation, large-scale solar across South Carolina. And this has all happened at a time when we've seen decreasing amounts of coal on South Carolina's system. It's pretty incredible to think that right now we have only 4 coal plants left operating in South Carolina, 3 of those coal plants are slated for retirement by the end of this decade. And so one of the main questions we're faced with is what's going to replace that capacity, and what's going to meet the emerging needs that are growing in our electricity system, and do it in a way that satisfies customer desires and does that reliably and does it cost effectively. And so that's really the meat of this conversation today, is talking a little bit about where we are right now and what's happened most recently in the regulatory arena, but really looking forward and thinking about whether the policy and regulatory structure and opportunities are there to continue to take advantage of the clean energy resources that we have within our borders. So I expect this conversation will illuminate those various paths as we continue to march towards a clean energy future. Let me just start by giving a quick introduction of our panelists, and then we'll jump into the first topic. We've got Jamie Golden with Google, who's Energy Regulatory Counsel for Global Energy Markets and Policy. He's a former partner at Nelson Mullins and former Chief Counsel for the Labor, Commerce, and Industry Committee with the South Carolina House of Representatives, which is actually where I met Jamie back in 2013 and 14, when we spent multiple years working on Act 236 and ushering that towards the governor's desk for her signature. We also have Sunrun Senior Manager of Public Policy, Thad Cully, former Regional Director and Regulatory Counsel at Vote Solar. And Thad's also been a key participant in the creation and implementation of South Carolina's 2 landmark energy policies, Act 62 and Act 236. Don Zimmerman is the President and CEO of Alder Energy, who's a leading commercial solar developer headquartered in South Carolina and a longtime participant in policy efforts that have shaped South Carolina's clean energy landscape. Don was one of the first people I met when I started working on solar back in 2007, 2008, and really helped me get my feet under me as I started diving into this incredibly complicated energy world that we live in. We also have Josh Brooks with Brooks Form LLC. He's the co-founder and CEO of Brooks Form and the former chief of staff for Amory Lovins at RMI. And we're fortunate to have Josh back in the Carolinas consulting on clean energy advancement in the Southeast. And Josh has spent the last 18 months or so working closely on the EO 80 process in North Carolina, which was initiated by their governor. So I'm sure he's going to be able to share some lessons learned from those conversations to the north. And then finally, Eddie Moore with the Coastal Conservation League. He's their energy and climate director. He's a former administrative law judge at the Arkansas Public Service Commission, and Eddie's been intimately involved in all things energy in South Carolina for a while now. And so I'm just beyond pleased to be hosting this or moderating this conversation, and I think you'll appreciate what these folks have to offer. So we've got this broken up into 3 different kind of subheadings, and then we'll get into details after some introductory comments from the speakers on each of these. We're going to start with customer-sided distributed generation, and I'm going to turn it over to Thad Cully to talk about what's going on in the residential space and what we've seen recently on policies like net metering in South Carolina. So with that, Thad, it is all yours.
Thanks, Hamilton, and I'm going to enforce some time discipline on myself and hit start on my timer just to make sure I don't go too far over here. I tend to get excited and carried away talking about this issue, but just for starters, I'm going to talk about net metering. I think it's been an important policy for South Carolina. This really goes back to first being put into place by the Public Service Commission in 2008, subject to a cap on participation that was 0.2% of the utility peak. So that's a very small amount, but at the time, there was really no risk that the market was going to take off and hit that cap. I think by 2013, we only had about 300 or 350 statewide net metering customers. So that's where it's really impressive to say what a success the collaboration of the utilities and all the stakeholders to put together Act 236 and initiate programs that really did kickstart the market. We've gone from 300 customers in 2013, thanks to Act 236, up to about 20,000 residential and commercial customers in South Carolina across all the utilities that have installed solar and participate in net metering. So that's 0 to 60 as fast as electric F-150, and that's the only comment I'm going to make about Ford today, just to get that on the table. But happy to be here. Thanks to E4 and thanks to everyone for your attention to this. What I did want to address is recently there have been some changes, and I mean very recently. As of this week, we've had commission action on Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress's kind of solar choice metering, which is the net metering successor tariff. And a few weeks ago, we also had the commission take action on Dominion's proposed successor to net metering. Now, the reason we're even talking about a successor to net metering is there was a cap on participation set by Act 236 at 2%. And as I said, we had a very successful run. Duke Energy Carolinas was the first to run up against that cap in May. I think in June of 2018. And they worked with stakeholders to keep that program open despite hitting their cap, to allow time for further collaboration and to come back to the legislature and ultimately seek what we got through Act 62, which was to say the existing net metering program will phase out and a successor program established by the boundaries and the conditions the legislature set in Act 62 would take effect as of June 1st, 2021. So we are on the doorstep of a new era on customer-sided solar in the state. So that's very exciting. Since we had about a year and a half between the passage of Act 62 and the deadline to have new tariffs in place, I want to give some credit to Duke where it's due to Duke Energy for hosting some meetings to invite stakeholders to share ideas and to initiate dialogue. I think those meetings were very fruitful. And my company at the time, I was actually with Vote Solar participating in these conversations. But Sunrun and Vote Solar and groups represented by the Southern Environmental Law Center were able to find a common ground with Duke Energy on what the successor tariff would look like. Now, for some context nationally, you may know that net metering attracts a lot of heat and smoke when it's brought before utility commissions. Can often be one of the more contentious things that happens before a utility commission, with lots of public comment and like I said, just a lot of attention. So I think this was a mutually agreeable. We didn't want to go down that path. So I appreciate the fact that there was a willingness very early on to avoid all of that drama. So I think we had I can't say a dramaless proceeding, but I think a very successful presentation of a pretty innovative idea. And to get to the nub of it, net metering involves putting solar on your rooftop, using what you can behind the meter, and then getting a credit for what you export to the grid. And most customers now currently have kind of a flat rate structure. So no matter what time of day, no matter what time of year, they're going to get credited the full retail rate, say 11 cents, for anything they put to the grid. Well, where things have moved, and this is true in both the Duke and Dominion dockets, is we're moving to a time-based credit. So you're still able to net, and that is you're going to take a measurement based on what you've put to the grid and what you've taken from the grid in a month. But now we're going to look within time bins. And so that's really the essence of what the Duke Energy settlement was a move to a time of use rate that also had a critical peak pricing element, which means of the handful of days a year where a majority of the peak costs are found, we're going to send this extra price signal to customers to reduce their consumption. And this, I think, is a very it's an evolution of where things have been. It's smarter than a flat rate, and I realize we're running low on time, so I'm going to try and wrap this up. But what I think is really exciting about the settlement was we're pairing in not just rooftop solar, but demand response. We're using smart thermostat, providing an upfront incentive for customers that want to engage in this, to install a smart thermostat and to respond to price signals that Duke sends on the days where it needs help. This is going to help with winter peaks immensely. And this is still, the incentive itself is before the commission, and hopefully we'll see resolution of that later this summer. But the first piece, the rate design and the time of use netting, That was approved by the commission this week. And so that is going to be moving forward. We expect to see those tariffs be filed. In the Dominion docket, I will say there was not a compromise. It was a traditional heat and smoke kind of proceeding. And the commission rejected Dominion's proposal and adopted the intervener's proposal, which was to move to a time of use rate, but to maintain netting over an annual period. So I think both are moving in the right direction, in the direction that's going to support the future of DER and storage and other devices. But it's heartening to see that things have not, rooftop solar and its success since 2014 hasn't been thrown to the wayside. That there's actually a really, I think, meaningful path ahead. And I will stop there. I've gone 2 minutes over what I promised. So thanks, Hamilton.
That was great, Thad, and we'll you'll have another chance to take a bite of this apple when we get to the discussion as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Don Zimmerman to talk a little bit about what's happening with commercial rates in South Carolina.
Well, I think Thad did a really good job at summarizing kind of the recent action, if you will, at the Public Service Commission. I just talk a little bit about Alder Energy. We started here in 2008. I think Hamilton, you alluded to we've been at this for a while. Originally spent a lot of time in the residential space, and now we've recently just kind of transitioned completely over to commercial and small community solar type size projects. What we became interveners in this most recent solar choice docket, predominantly because we were concerned that the commercial interests of our customers were not necessarily being well represented. And so the good thing that happened here, particularly let's talk about Duke to start with, that Thad and other people, particularly in the conservation area, were very good at negotiating a time of use rate and a good compromise, if you will. Our concern was that it was a little bit vague in terms of how it would impact commercial clients, and because of that, we decided to get involved. We generally don't get involved in the Public Service Commission. We try and kind of let the experts take care of it, who are on this team here. But in this case, it ended up well. We were able to negotiate a good settlement that kind of relied on the good, solid work that was done by the residential interests who are on the team here. But in particular, there are a couple of things that we were concerned about, and that was, one is the stability of rates. Our commercial customers, I think all customers, want to have some predictability in terms of their economic performance. And so we were able to kind of get a 10-year commitment on the new rate being in place. And in this particular case with Duke, it was a rider. And Duke has a set of rates where almost everybody in the commercial space is on demand rate. So except for people that are below 30 kilowatts. And so the issue of cost shift, if you will, was not really a big deal because that demand rate is sitting out there. So we were able to basically just have this rider which allowed people to stay on their existing rates. But the other big issue was SRECs. A lot of commercial clients wanted to retain their SRECs. Act 236 had the SRECs going to the utility. So that was a point of concern, and we were able to come up with a reasonable compromise, I think, that allowed the SRECs to retain with the client, with the system owner, and with a small fee being paid to Duke for the reporting of those SRECs, reporting of those SRECs. So all in all, with Duke, I mean, I think it went very well. I think I would like to say that I think that has a lot to do with the original stakeholder intervention. They had these big stakeholder groups They got together, they asked questions, everybody kind of hashed it out. To contrast with what was going on with Dominion, from my perspective as a user, it felt like they just dropped a big load of stuff on my desk. And it was very hard to take, because when we started doing the calculations on that, we felt that it was basically going to kill the industry. Our payback intervals went, and it was hard to calculate because we don't have hourly data for everybody. But it was, our estimates were it was going to effectively, at a minimum, double payback intervals, and in a worst case scenario, I had 67 years of payback. In other words, twice the lifetime of the system. So it would never pay back. That was hard fought. The biggest challenge there were the subscription charges, and the hourly netting. Those were the two really tough ones. Going back and looking at, well, what would make sense. Time of use rates do have a real value here, and Dominion had this challenge that they didn't have their rate 9, where most people were on, was just a volumetric rate with no real time of use, no peak intervals. And so by going to a time of use rate, which is what we proposed, and we were able to achieve annual netting in parallel with what that had indicated. We have a very strong rate, I think, that will continue the industry going forward, but will incentivize people to not use as much energy during peak intervals because of the time of use. And once again, SRECs were a big issue here, and the commission saw fit to basically put them in the hands of the owners, which is where we believe they should have been. So in terms of net metering, I think we're in good shape for the near future. The only other issue I would probably want to highlight is that we want to make sure that the other options besides net metering are still available. Those being offset sell, which is essentially where you're offsetting at the retail rate for anything you consume on site. And then anything that you're exporting, you get avoided costs for. We want to maintain that. There are situations where, let's say, you don't qualify for a net metering tariff. You're greater than a megawatt behind the meter. We need to make sure that that option still exists for people. And there's a couple others, offset only, which doesn't give any value for the energy that gets pushed back to the grid, which doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, I've said my piece. I really think that that we came out of this solar choice docket in a good position to keep this industry going forward, and I look forward to trying to help to get more and more renewables onto the grid.
All right, thanks, Don. So that's a great snapshot of where things stand today in South Carolina coming out of these recent proceedings. Josh, can you talk a little bit about what innovation in the customer space looks like as we move forward?
Yeah, I had a really interesting experience last year while helping to manage and facilitate the B1 process. I was doing something very similar in the Western U.S. For the next iteration of the California net metering tariff. And that illuminated a lot of really interesting issues of where policy development is and how it's trying to anticipate where innovation is going. There's a gentleman who said something to the effect of, innovation isn't about getting more widgets. It's about the widgets you have doing more complicated things and syncing together and all of that. And so I guess that's the frame for the comments that I'll make today. Really, it seems that policy and innovation or policy responding to innovation in particular to distributed resources, the task is to marry policy and business models uh, that respond and work better with just the physics of electricity. So this is demand response, this is dispatch, all at the aggregate level, and moving stuff around. There was a piece this morning that kind of uh, uh, restructured my comments a little bit, but it seems that Green Mountain Power last week announced that they were doing a new program with I think it's 200 Tesla Powerwall systems, and they've proven over the last week that it adequately has become a frequency response program and is actually returning value to the participants. I think they get the customers who participate in this program that allow the utilities to control some of their non crucial systems get something like $13.50 a month for their efforts there. But that's not at all unique to Green Mountain Power. There's states, all in the union that are working on this thing, from Colorado to Hawaii. A point that I would make, or that I will make, and I'll try to wrap up here, but um, you know, the prevalence and the growing distributed resources on the grid. Don't think that these are happening in vacuums. These are actually collaborations across industries. I mean, the one thing that I'm seeing a lot of work in are the rising DC microgrids. They're just looking for ways to optimize each transaction. So homes now with different community developments, and you can see a number of companies in this space already are building, little suburban areas, and they're all DC microgrids. And the idea is to optimize the production with the consumption. And where do we find really good use cases for this? RVs and yachts. These manufacturers have been doing this for quite some time, so it's not like the technology is not out there. And you're seeing that in these residential communities, but it is certainly happening in industrial applications as well. Where there are a number of companies that are trying to help solve the need for electric motor drives and everything. For example, Turntide. That's a product that is optimized to perform an engine or a pump service to actually do that, but without having to worry about a variable frequency drive or what have you, to really capture the performance and the service provided. Ultimately, I think that's what all this is getting into. When I made that comment earlier about business models that more accurately reflect the physics of energy, it's the service at the end of the day that people care about. As my former boss, Amory, would always say, hot showers and cold beer. People don't care about kilowatt hours. They want hot showers and cold beer. So I think that that's what we're all building towards, guys, just a world with more hot showers and cold beer. But Thad's happy about this.
Well, I'm glad it's Friday. Those two things are not that far away. I appreciate that overview, and I think that's a good kind of lead into a discussion here, Josh, about how appropriate is it to think about the DG world and customer sided generation as we look at what's coming up with coal retirement in South Carolina? How big a role is that going to play? Are we thinking about larger scale resources exclusively, or should our utilities and the industry be thinking about the role that customer sided plays in making this transition as we take these resources offline and decide what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, we'll all have to, right? It seems to me that that can't be avoided. So if you look, I think if you adjust for inflation and you tie it to GDP, growth of renewables over the last, I think it's a variety of renewables, not just solar, but over the last, I think it's 40 years, has had something like 20x the impact to the grid as new renewable generation. What I mean to say is efficiency has scaled at about 25x renewables if you link it all to GDP over the last 40 years or whatever. So that tells me that that's where the growth opportunity is, the business opportunity. There's a paper by a gentleman, Kingsmill Bond, and he looks back over a lot of innovations in a number of different sectors, and he says 2% market share is when the pivot tends to happen and investors get attracted to the new technology. So that's, I'm just trying to illustrate that point. Yes, particularly with things like for 2222 and the now mandate and the growing desire and ability to aggregate these distributed resources to perform critical grid services. I think ultimately, it's easy for me to envision a world where utilities and customers are incentivized to not hang on to a traditional business model, but instead, um, I guess capture the value of what they could already be doing. No need to duplicate effort.
I haven't heard, Josh, you've mentioned it a couple times with the Tesla Powerwall and the role of storage in this conversation. But going back to Thad and Don, how are you guys seeing the storage market at the residential and commercial level play out in South Carolina today, and how might that change? And I have one more question to this. Is the net metering solutions, the solar choice solutions that we just adopted, are those going to encourage adoption of storage?
I'm happy to go first, or Don, I'm happy to cede the floor.
Either way.
So yeah, first, Sunrun is a provider of solar services, including solar plus storage. I believe we've got about over 20,000 systems, maybe 30,000 across the country. One thing I'll say is if we look to the Texas experience with the outages, we saw interest in that product, skyrocket within the next week. We had about 300% increase to web traffic, kind of scoping that out. So I think the interest in kind of home resilience is going to grow, particularly we're heading into a very busy hurricane season. And I think I'm glad Josh brought up Order 2222. To the extent that what happened at FERC and as the ISOs, RTOs are filing compliance filings and working with the industry to come up with solutions for aggregators, and Sunrun is a company that has an aggregator of DERs. So we're interested in that, but in places where there is no RTO, I think it's really going to be important to have policies that are developed with the utility that help them address their need. And a lot of times this is going to be with customer-sided storage and solar. You're addressing the peak issues. You're helping do demand response to reduce peak, not necessarily addressing the base load. So I know bring your own device programs are kind of contemplated in the memorandum of understanding that was the basis of the settlement that was filed and approved with the commission. So I think the next iteration of the solar choice, it's currently demand response with smart thermostat. I think it very easily to see there's a path for solar plus storage to step in and also provide the same kind of response to reduce peak when it's needed. And the question is going to be, do we create a value stream that's sufficient for investors, sufficient for customers to make it worthwhile? So I know that's saying a lot, but to the extent Order 2222 might unlock things nationally in the Carolinas, I think it's really upon us to work together to find a solution that works for these vertically integrated utilities.
Yeah, so I think to your point, you very, very well said. I can tell you a little bit about our experience. The residential space, predominantly any storage systems we have implemented were resiliency oriented, right? The expense of putting these systems in is not trivial, and because of that, it was really the guys. We've had a few people that just say, I want to be off the grid if necessary, right? So some with what you call it the prepper mentality. Others will say, look, I've got a very critical load here that has to stay. This refrigerator has to keep working even in the Botox can't melt, right? Or whatever it is. And those scenarios are few and far between. I think in order to have more wide scale adoption, there needs to be an economic driver, and that economic driver needs to be a price tag that's put on being able to either disassociate from the grid or feed into the grid at the appropriate time. And that does really requires that cooperation with utility. I think moving, to the question you asked, Hamilton, moving with these solar choice tariffs to time of use is going to help that. When I have a 20-cent peak rate, you're going to start asking questions. Okay, well, can I store some of the power that was generated off peak and push it forward? And I think that will help to drive some of that. We personally haven't looked too deeply at it because these are relatively new. The other thing that we have looked at is demand response, or essentially eliminating peaks, demand charges. Those are getting to be cost effective, but haven't had a lot of buyers at this point.
All right. Well, I appreciate the robust discussion on the customer-sided resources that we see in the market today. Let's shift over to actually talking about co-retirements and integrated resource planning in South Carolina. I'm going to start with Eddie Moore, who's really one of the key architects of the IRP statute under Act 62, and let him give us some insight into where this conversation stands at the moment.
Thanks, Hamilton. Really kind of distracted by all that distributed generation talk. I feel like we're shifting from, in a way, talking about a market in the edge of the grid to centralized planning, although, the two can overlap a lot and there can be flexibility. So I just wanted to, going back to what Bonnie said, I think she started talking about change, it's an easy topic to kind of organize things around, but I thought I'd just review a little bit without delving into details of individual IRPs that, we're at this really tantalizing moment, I think, where the law has been revised and a lot of discussion has happened over at the PSC, maybe more discussion than some people can stand, but really a lot of in-depth testimony and consideration. But no major utility in South Carolina right now has an approved IRP. So we know the process has changed, but we don't yet know where we're headed. And I think that's, one of the values of having the discussion here today, to flesh out where there's maybe common ground for that type of progress. But even though there aren't approved IRPs right now for the major utilities, I think you can say there has been significant movement or change in the practice of IRPs. And so I'll talk a little bit about Dominion because I think it's an illustrative case. I don't think it matches one for one with Duke or even with Santee Cooper for that matter, but just to kind of illustrate a point that you could go back, I think 3 years, maybe 4 years, and the IRP was a single option filed by the utility without review. And it then progressed, and I have to give credit here to Dominion that this is not driven by the Energy Freedom Act. This is voluntary, to something that reviewed a range of options, but then without, again, this kind of stakeholder involvement and intervener involvement. And then, now we're getting an iteration where there's a range of futures considered, a range of resources considered, but with really in-depth review. And I think that change over time in how the IRP is approached in the state, it's not just a change in procedure, it's it's a change in the nature of what the IRP is. I think earlier it was an informational filing. It was information provided by the utility about what its internal plan was. And now we've moved to a situation where it's a more of a due diligence decision-making document. It's not just a document, it's a process. I remember the first time somebody tried to explain to me what an IRP was. They said it's a plan, but it's also a process. And so now we are working our way towards having a process that helps make better decisions in the state. So I think, one of the things that makes it complicated right now, this is often true with new, policies. It gives you that sense of fixing the wheel while the car is still rolling. The change in process, the change in purpose is coming at the time when we're seeing really changed circumstances. So when IRPs were first conceived of, the real goal was to figure out what to do with the next increment of growth. People had experienced decades of fast growth in electricity usage, and there were some major investment decisions that went wrong. And so that's how regulators and the public started becoming involved in the planning. So we have this process that was really developed for making the next big growth decision, adding to the grid, adding generation. And now it has to be used under circumstances where the growth has been flat for a long time. And the real decisions facing us are retirement decisions. So instead of growth driving the decision, retirements are driving the decisions. And the retirements, of course, right now that we're looking at it's not exclusively actually, but mostly coal plant retirements. And, the way I think about it, though, it's not really just retiring baseload or retiring coal. We're taking this process developed maybe in the 80s, and we're trying to morph it to deal with technology change. So not just the change from fossil to renewables, but a little earlier than that, like the fracking change, that was driven by technology as well. And underlying all that it's really the revolution in information and computing capability that created all the analytics that drove the material science improvements, the ability to, analyze the shape of a windmill blade so that you could get 40% increases in efficiency in a short period of time. And that, we're looking at the more individualized, the granular changes from gas to coal, from coal to gas, from gas to renewables, from renewables to renewables plus storage. But really, we're going to see the capability to use information to come up with new things. That's driving it. And so in a way, it's really appropriate to have an information-based process like IRP to try to address that. In another way, it's a little bit clunky. And I think that's why people think sometimes about trying to come up with a market-based mechanism. The one other thing I'll point out about the specific decisions facing us, we're looking at all the major utilities facing a similar decision on a similar timeline. So retiring a lot of baseload generation, Dominion's doing its thing, Duke's doing its thing, Santee Cooper's doing its thing. To a large degree, they're the same thing on the same timeline. And what that means is that the decisions, and I know this has been acknowledged in some of the utility filings, they're not islands, it's regional. So there's a regional aspect to this I think we will probably get into a little bit later. But one of the challenges we face is how to use a utility-specific IRP filing to fully accommodate the regional nature of the transition that's happening. One more thing about that the nature of dealing with retirement as a driver for investment decisions rather than growth, it raises questions in a different way. So the resilience and reliability issues, I think, come to the fore a little more when you're subtracting large generators to the grid rather than interconnecting a new one. I'll just make a side comment about Josh's observations and the whole distributed generation topic, which is that technology and the markets are delivering a lot of things that customers can do, that investors can do, that service companies can do. But under the system we have, the only thing that customers are allowed to do is what the tariff allows them to do. And so it almost doesn't matter how many whiz-bang things are out there if you don't write a tariff in a way that allows us to take advantage of them. And that's, I think, a real regulatory challenge, and it affects the IRP because the plan can only be optimized if tariffs, often written in a different proceeding, allow it to be optimized. So I'll just close on one thought that, as complicated as all of this sounds, this transition, I think, from an informational filing to a decision-making document is really tied together by a fortuitous few words in the statute that I don't even know who suggested them. Maybe it was Steve Davidson, but the concept that the commission is looking for the most reasonable and prudent plan. And I think as generalized as that is, it does provide an organizing principle to try to bring some of these things to resolution.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. That's an excellent overview of where things stand right now. It's interesting. We've got it has been noted with the modified Dominion plan. You've got 2 coal plants that are scheduled for retirement towards the end of the decade. Duke has a accelerated retirement plan, and coal retirement's embedded on different timelines in their various portfolios. So, Josh, I'm going to turn to you and maybe talk a little bit about what are the ways in which we can ensure those retirements are cost effective and done to the benefit of customers, and how do we think about replacing that capacity?
Yeah, that is the burden. I mean, that is the burden that the utilities are under, right? They're obligated to provide reliable least cost service for the privilege of having a territory, and then and the market, and then they have some regulatory oversight. There was a study, I think it was last year. It's something like, and I may get the numbers wrong by a few digits, so please forgive me if I do, but it's something like 39% of the global coal-fired power plants are uncompetitive right now, and the projection is by 2022 that's up to the mid 50s, and then by 2025 it's in the 70s. So there's an aspect of this in which those assets are going to be too costly to operate yet because of, and this actually kind of ties well into to a point Eddie had just made about, sure, there are all these solutions, but it depends entirely on how the tariff's designed and all this stuff. So, for example, the way that a lot of the coal assets on the grid are designed, they're protected from economic shocks like that. Those costs are rate base. They've been allocated and spread out for 20 years on the customer base, and those rate shocks sometimes can be felt by the rate payer. One tool that we discussed a lot during the Executive Order 80 process, the B1 process, was securitization, and this is something that utilities have done for a very long time for unanticipated costs. But recently, because of the economics of coal, when stacked against newer tech, is so costly, securitization has kind of become a tool that utilities can use to help speed the retirement of these assets while also funding investment in clean energy technologies. For those of you who aren't familiar, and I will confess that I am not the best scholar on securitization. However, I know them. I'll introduce you. I'm happy to do that. It's basically like, refinancing your mortgage. You help lower the cost of that debt on the debt and equity that's been invested in the plant, to help speed the retirement, invest in clean energy, and yeah, pretty much that's it. You get to take advantage of the lower cost of the more competitive assets that you're developing. The ratepayers benefit because their rates are lower because they're no longer paying these inflated costs for these legacy assets, and it gives the utility a new capital expenditure opportunity, which is always exciting for shareholders, right? So it's one of those rare instances where you can theorize like a win-win-win scenario, and that seems to be quite popular. The question then becomes, okay, if we are retiring a traditionally owned asset in, the Southeast market, for example, whatever asset replaces that, is it a utility asset? Is it an IPP asset? Is it some mixture of demand response plus another asset whose ownership is yet to be defined? Like, these are the questions that raises, and that will take, some kind of process where stakeholders, in the state come to discuss what they would like the mix to be. The utilities get the opportunity to just to convey what their needs are. To provide this service, they need XYZ. So you need this kind of process to work through those things. The ideal being whatever it ultimately is least cost to the ratepayer is what's going on. But I could say more, but I'm feeling myself getting worked up to a monologue, and I need to cut off before I do that because we'll be here a while.
Well, that's a great overview, and so I want to turn to Jamie Golden, because Google obviously has a large interest in what the energy mix in the Carolinas looks like, and I know you guys have been very involved in both North Carolina and South Carolina around the securitization conversation around how resources are procured. Can you give us some insight, Jamie, into how y'all are thinking about this?
Yeah, thanks, Hamilton, and mighty proud to be here today. I thought we were here to talk about the new Ford pickup truck, so I don't know what I'm going to talk about now. So, but no, Google, on behalf of Google, we do operate data centers, and we have a large data center in Berkeley County, which is co-op served through Berkeley Electric, and then we have a data center in Lenoir, North Carolina, which is Duke served. And we're certainly always working with I consider them our partners on the supply and on getting to that. But at the same time, as we've talked about, regulatory actions and legislative changes are sometimes needed where there's disagreement. Google's perspective is certainly different and on energy than a lot of industrials. I don't think that anybody would disagree with that statement. We've put it out there that we went 100% renewable through RECs in 2017. We now are more ambitious, and we've got to figure it out. But we have made a moonshot of getting to 24/7 every hour of every day, every year, fueled by carbon-free energy by 2030, and that's going to take a lot of effort to get there. And as all of you know, coal does not fit that profile, and so coal is not something that that we support. We think it's for many reasons. I want to talk though just generally as a large customer now, I guess, take off, this is me talking just as a large customer, that, coal, and we can talk about the environmental impact of it, environmental justice, you name it. But at the end of the day, it's also uneconomic. And that's something I think almost all large customers can agree with. Now, there are large customers that do think that it's a necessary base load. I'll use that word, but it's a necessary component of generation. But those are few and far between, because I think Josh pointed out that most of the studies are showing that basically, I think the majority of coal plants that are still online are being kept online uneconomically. They would not clear in a competitive market, and they could be actually replaced by dispatchable solar and wind projects with battery at this point, in most situations. So, coal is just not going forward a sustainable model, sustainable source of energy. Problem is, as we've all talked about, how do we pay for it? How do we retire it? The utilities are entitled to a reasonable rate of return. But what is that? And, we've been paying for coal for a long time, and we've been paying, as I said, if it's non-economic, I guess a premium for coal to stay online. So, we want to see it come off for economic reasons and environmental reasons. Again, what tools are in the toolbox to minimize that and to make everyone whole? And I do like the win-win-win approach, of securitization. It's almost like refining on a house or an office building right now. And you go and you're making everybody whole. They're still getting paid, but you are reducing basis points for that return. But at the same time, nobody's left holding the bag. And so I think the path forward in the Carolinas, especially, and you pointed out, I think the coal portfolios here, to my knowledge, Duke's coal is in North Carolina. So there's really not much, there's not much legislative activity here that could happen. I think it's worth consensus building. And I think those conversations are going on with that utility in North Carolina about retiring that coal, a plan for retiring that coal. Obviously, the IRPs are out there, but I think there are actual, conversations going on what that plan looks like, how much of it's securitized, and I hope that progress can be made on that. Dominion, on the other hand, we've got the coal plants in South Carolina, and we've got to figure out what to do with that. And I think securitization is a good way to pay for whatever the remaining life is that they're entitled or would argue they're entitled to recoup. And so I think that's a conversation that needs to be had at the legislature. I think, the problem is you really with policymakers and with regulators, we all know you typically only get one bite at the apple in a lot of instances. And so when something like securitization, which is a super complex issue, comes up, we need to thoroughly explain it. And if we thoroughly explain that it's good for retiring certain assets, we're going to get the question, why not others, or recouping certain costs, and so I think that there are numerous things that securitization could be used for other than coal. So why not use it for coal at the same time? Let's have that robust discussion all in one, in one package. Sort of makes sense to me. So we don't end up having to try to get a second bite at the apple. But again, I think the future, the data I see, the thought, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, if coal, natural gas, and then, we'd have lithium ion, and we'd have solar plus, and we'd have other projects. We don't, we just don't have those we don't have that need right now. We're there. I mean, I don't think there is a bridge fuel with the nuclear that's online. And I would be surprised. In fact, I think I saw a relicensure was made the other day on one of the plants in the region. I'm not aware of any push to stop the relicensure of the existing nuclears. In fact, that's an important component to getting to a carbon-free economy. That's a very important component of it. Vogtle next door is coming online. That provides a massive source of power that's got to go somewhere. And so I don't know that natural gas as the bridge fuel is needed anymore. And I think we're starting to see that. So I think the transition from coal is time. And I think it's time to use our existing nukes, use what is coming online next door with Vogtle and some collaboration of that, and then go out and bid the least cost, resource over and make sure we're accounting for a period of time so that we don't end up with a stranded asset. Because today, if you bid today natural gas, it probably would clear as the least cost. But if you put a time frame around it and you put, what we presume to be some carbon pricing coming, it doesn't, it typically isn't going to be your least cost. So that's the customer view that I kind of bring here.
Yeah, it's an interesting last point, Jamie, on what can the market deliver. And some of what we've seen in other places like Colorado tends to be held up as an example, Indiana as well, where you actually had regulators and utilities and others in the market generally may be skeptical of whether you can take coal offline and replace it with anything but natural gas. But by using an all source procurement process, what they found in those two states was actually a combination of wind and solar and storage was the most cost effective option that could come in and reliably do the job. And I know, so Eddie, both in the Dominion proceeding, the Dominion IRP proceeding, we've got these two coal plants that have been identified for retirement. Dominion currently is proposing to replace those with gas capacity primarily. And that's due to the economic / reliability analysis they've done. But, there's debate about that from interveners and questioning whether or not actually can you do this cheaper and reliably with clean energy alternatives. And then likewise in the Duke IRP, you all sponsored witness John Wilson that spoke directly on this all source procurement perspective and encouraged the Public Service Commission to start thinking about this as a means to understand what the market can actually produce. And so I'm wondering if maybe you'll elaborate on those two issues.
Yeah. So I think, like I say, I think we're at the point where you have the question of what replaces not just baseload generation, but whatever the needs of the utility are. It could be baseload, it could be peaking. And those are, in a way, old categories of describing how it's, I think, still largely descriptive, but of how a utility, their resource mix. And in areas with markets, they attempt to define as a product all the different services that a resource can bring. So it could be ramping, it could be capacity, could be energy. And so I think one view we have is that all those needs should be put on the table. And in the same way that we've kind of progressed from having a more simplistic analysis to a more sophisticated one, that you can't assume something like 1-for-1 retirement of megawatts. If you had, it's quite likely and it's quite common that utilities have, over time, they've accumulated whatever fleet of generators they have, and it no longer, to use some of the older metrics, it no longer fits the load duration curve. So it's likely that if a utility company is retiring 600 megawatts of load, it doesn't exactly need 600 megawatts of base load. In fact, if you look back at the VC summer analysis, that was the alternative, was looking at exactly the same number of megawatts of gas in exactly the same onset year, or bringing it on the grid. And if you build nuclear plants, you do need to build 2 units to make any type of argument about it being economic. But if you're building combined cycle plants, you don't need to do that size of project at the same place in the same number of megawatts. So I think the retirement analysis that is upcoming here in South Carolina needs to be able to characterize the needs on the front end in such a way that we can figure out what is actually needed and what can best meet it. And in a way, the all source procurement process, it's sort of like trying to create a mini market. You're defining the project that you need and having a bidding process to meet it without creating a regional market to do that for everyone. So I think there's a similarity there in an attempt to use a market-based approach. Not so much, I think there have been a lot of different jurisdictions that have used competitive procurement in a more limited sense. For instance, a utility may decide it needs baseload generation or it needs gas-fired generation of a specific type, and then have a bidding process to meet that. That's not really the same thing as what Colorado designed, which is not just attracting different manufacturers of the same thing to get competition in production and delivery. It's really designed, again, going back to that theme of information, to find out what the market can deliver, to get the best ideas. And I think that ties into that statutory purpose of the most reasonable and prudent plan. So I think there's a lot of overlap here between the goals of the IRP, the statute, and the thinking about how you attract the best ideas to provide the most reasonable and prudent services in South Carolina going forward. And I'll just say something I didn't say earlier, but this whole kind of transition from a more, one company's disclosure of what it intends to do to a more public process where the future is debated. One thing that's done for us, because that sounds kind of theoretical, but it's really brought us to the point where we're grappling with the real issues in front of us. In other words, a lot of IRP filings, I'm not just saying in South Carolina, they're really kind of delaying a decision or obscuring a decision, maybe not for nefarious purposes, but because there was not much reason to figure out what's happening 20 years from now. But I don't think there's anybody who believes, even though there were filings showing coal plants running into the 2040s, I don't think anybody, even those filing it, believe that's what's happening. But now we're in a situation where we're acknowledging that is the transition that's happening, and we're trying to think through how to deal with it in a reasonable way. And we've talked about some of the tools here that should be part of the picture. That the distributed generation is a piece of it, a more sophisticated reliability analysis. Leveraging what customers can do, attracting a wide range of technology suppliers to really crowdsource more of the latest intelligence on what technologies are available. So that's a little wide ranging, but I tried to tie it together.
No, it's helpful, and as has been pointed out a couple times here, we've got a vertically integrated marketplace in the Southeast. So the function of the market in other regions around the country is a little bit different here, and we have to be much more deliberate in taking advantage of price discovery opportunities and making sure our what we have on paper fits with what's going on in the real world. And to that end, the discussion around our market structure in the Southeast has continued to gain momentum and attention. The utilities in the Southeast to file the Southeast Energy Exchange Market proposal at FERC. We've got a RTO study committee in South Carolina. And Jamie, I'd like you to talk a little bit about in more detail what's going on with those proposals and that activity, and then we'll open this one up for discussion as well.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Hamilton. So the legislature in the 2020 pandemic shortened session, the very last act signed into law, I think probably shows how important it was to them, but the very last act signed into law was Act 87 of 2020, and that created the RTO Market Reform Study Committee. And it was supported in South Carolina by customer groups, by the electric cooperatives, by Duke Energy and Dominion. And Hamilton, I know, I believe you've been appointed. I was appointed by Senator Rankin as a large customer representative, as the large customer representative for the Senate. And my understanding is in the next month we're going to get that kicked off. And so excited about that. I think a little bit concerning though is, and I mean, I'll just say what it is that in North Carolina, Duke Energy and the co-ops have lobbied against it and have told us straight up they oppose it, and they're opposed to it, and are actively working against having a study on this. And that's disappointing because, and I think Josh can probably speak a little bit to it, but Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80 group, his DEQ did recommend that same study out of that process. And then just this week, the Republican Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, he chairs by statute an energy advisory committee under DEQ, and they voted unanimously to write a letter to the General Assembly to support House Bill 611 in North Carolina, which is Larry Strickland's bill. And so maybe despite, the electric cooperatives of North Carolina and Duke opposing that legislation, we can get some progress there, but it doesn't have to have their input. We just don't want them to become an island like Texas, and because they love to talk about Texas, but if you disconnect and South Carolina and Virginia are in it, well, you kind of become an island. So there's momentum here, and it is it's real. It's it's being led. I mean, good Lord, you look at who's leading on it. You've got the committee that's been appointed in South Carolina is the ranking House members, Merle Smith, who's the chairman of Ways and Means, arguably one of, if not the most influential legislators in the entire state of South Carolina. You've got Senator Tom Davis, who's the ranking Republican member on it. You've got Senator Brad Hutto, who is the minority leader for the South Carolina Senate, appointed to it. You got Wes Clymer from Rock Hill appointed to it. Jay West, who chairs the Public Utilities Committee in the House, appointed to it. So I think this, South Carolina is serious and, serious about taking a look at every single market. Texas is going to come up. Texas is going to come up, and there's nobody here advocating for ERCOT. I'm not here to defend it, but it's physically impossible for us to have that situation as we are, connected into the interconnect. And it also gives an opportunity to something I think one of the speakers said previously is a change in market allows for utilities to focus on an investment in infrastructure to facilitate that. And that's where I think the future could be, is having that. And so back to SEAM, which you referenced, I don't think there was, from what I've been told, there wasn't any intended transmission upgrades required to implement the SEAM platform. They acknowledge that is not a market, an energy imbalance market, nor is it an RTO. And FERC really, I was quite surprised in reading 2 weeks ago, FERC issued a 12-page deficiency letter. I believe they have 45 calendar days to reply to that and to correct those deficiencies. They being, I think it's 19-ish utilities stretching from Southern Company, Alabama Power, Mississippi Power, TVA, Dominion, South Carolina, Duke, in both states, and then some electric cooperatives in various other states, and some municipal power in North Carolina are part of the SEAM, proposal. But it was received a pretty harsh rebuke from FERC. I think the market manipulation concerns and lack of independent monitor were something that they really were worried about. I think also what we're talking about here today is, does it give an opportunity for independent power distributed generation to compete in it? And, we'll be interested to see, I'll be interested to see what is filed in response to SEEM, if anything. If no response is filed, then FERC, I guess, would deem it, presume would deem it deficient, and SEEM would not go forward. But, the markets conversation is alive and well. It's alive and well in North Carolina. It's just, we are facing those of us that want to take a look at this issue and study all of the outcomes are now facing very strong pushback from electricity providers from having that conversation, and it's unfortunate.
I'd like to piggyback on some stuff that Jamie just said, maybe provide a little bit of context within some fodder for additional conversation. For those of you on this meeting, if you haven't yet had the chance to look at the the North Carolina energy reform process on the Department of Environmental Quality's website, I would encourage you to. There were 4 main areas explored, one of which was wholesale market reform. And this is in the report. I'm not saying anything that hasn't already been put out there or something that you can't read for yourself. But the group of stakeholders that were looking specifically at wholesale markets, the key observation is, it's perhaps the obvious, but it bears stating. With South Carolina's Bill 4940 being as comprehensive as it is from the retail level all the way up to the wholesale, just there's a practical reality that if anything is done on the wholesale level in the South Carolina market, that will impact North Carolina. You have shared infrastructure, you have shared transmission, you have shared utility companies, right? All of these things will have, just seems to me that there will be an impact. And the stakeholders who were involved in drafting the wholesale proposal, which was a diverse group representing all stakeholders and the co-ops, and had membership in it, as did the municipalities and the big utilities, and quite literally there was almost a cross section of everyone represented. But they were keenly, concerned that some proposal stakeholder process in South Carolina could have, implications for the North Carolina market, and North Carolina wouldn't otherwise be participating in that. And so that was a worry for the stakeholders. Now, there are obvious, concerns that we would want to talk about with any kind of opening up of the Southeast market. I mean, it's, for example, and I think this may be one of the more important things, with any kind of market expansion and RTO, there aren't necessarily the same kind of access for just general customers. Stakeholders in those wholesale or those, like an RTO, for example, tend to begin and end with generation owners and sellers, buyers, etc. And otherwise, there's a membership fee and everything. So a concern again for the stakeholders in that process was, okay, if we do go down a study road, and okay, if we do revamp or adjust the market in some way, how do we protect the robust stakeholder participation that we've enjoyed thus far? And I mean, I know you all know what I'm talking about. It seems that there is a new stakeholder process going on in North and South Carolina every month. And as laborious as it can be, it does get the concerns elevated. So that would be, just to kind of illustrate both sides of the argument there. I wanted to add that context.
Yeah. So, I mean, one part of this discussion, and to tie it back to the clean energy aspect of this, the panel today, we've got net zero carbon targets that have been adopted by Dominion, South Carolina, that have been adopted by Duke Energy, and the path to deep decarbonization and significant additions of clean energy resources, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to do that without a more geographically diverse footprint coordinating the integration of those resources. And we are already seeing with the levels of solar penetration on the Dominion system and Duke system, more regular curtailment events where those solar generators in the system have to be turned down because they're producing more power than the system needs at a given moment. And you're seeing integration charges being levied and potentially increasing as the system is managed around the intermittency of those resources. But to the extent you have a larger geographic footprint, those concerns are either mitigated or go away to some extent. And of course, resources like storage are going to be important in playing a role there. And so, given that we do have fairly aggressive goals in the decades ahead, it seems to me that this is just an absolutely necessary conversation, and whether it's whether it's SEAM, whether it's an RTO, or whether it's some other permutation of market reform, the broader geographic kind of coordination seems necessary and inevitable in some form. And so, having this debate, this discussion right now, figuring out what those options are, seems to be more than appropriate.
And Hamilton, it's fair to say, right? I mean, I don't think anyone, Josh, you know more about the North Carolina process than anybody. I've yet to hear anyone say what the solution is. Just have the conversation, and to not have the conversation seems to me to be embracing ignorance. And I applaud South Carolina for having this conversation. And I applaud those in North Carolina, like Representative Strickland and others, that are actively pushing to have that same conversation. So, but if yet, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly, they're all going to be brought out, as we all know. And I don't think anybody's made up their mind yet. So again, I invite anyone to a conversation on it.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about transmission considerations, but I do want to pull Thad and Don back in here for a moment as well, and just get their perspective from customer-sided developers. I know Sunrun operates throughout the country and a lot of these wholesale markets, and I know, Don, you've done work in places like Maryland that has a different market structure. What do you guys think about this discussion? How important is it for y'all's business model?
Well, I think for our model, anything that we can do to have additional mechanisms for revenue generation at the customer premise, I think would be valuable. We talked about storage before, talked about demand management. Those are the types of things that will help us. Now, as to the larger issues of things like RTOs and such, I don't know that it has a direct impact on our customers. What we have seen, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Hamilton, or not, is in other jurisdictions, particularly you had mentioned Maryland. We do a fair amount of work up there in the community solar space. Their public service commission is much more engaged in the stakeholder input process. They have public PSC run net metering working group phone calls on a regular, bi-weekly basis, where we just hash out all the issues. In particular, this is with regards to community solar, but they also have equivalents when they're talking about net metering and other aspects. They also have a significantly greater and more technically savvy staff that they rely on, and that I see as a concern with our existing body, is that they appear to be I'll just say it as it is. I appear to be understaffed and overwhelmed. And I think that if we could get some legislative action to help to empower them and give them a little more budget, because they got a lot of questions. They got a lot of changes coming down the way. And they really need some expertise to help them to make good choices. And my perspective is really at the edge of the grid, so I really can't comment too much at the internals.
Thanks, Don. Thad,
Yeah.
what about you?
And yeah, and I kind of alluded to it earlier. Sunrun was one of the first to aggregate their customers into a bid into the New England ISO, and that's something that we anticipate doing more of. That's providing grid services and virtual power plants, as they're called. There are definitely RFPs that have happened across the country that Sunrun participates in and have secured. You can check the press releases for more details on those. But in terms of, I mentioned Order 2222, providing an outlet for providing these types of wholesale services. That's not necessarily exclusive. I mean, we operate in many states with access to these markets, but that still doesn't take away the value of well-designed retail policy that the state regulators can put in. It'd be great to have a one-size-fits-all federal policy that we're one and done. We don't have to work so hard at the state level, but I do think that there's something to be said for creating those opportunities for DERs to provide services under a retail tariff, short of having a wholesale market. Now, I'm not staking out a position on RTOs here today. My colleague is on the advisory group, and I will let him kind of do that in due time. But I think it's an exciting time when you think about what is on the horizon and the ability to aggregate resources that folks hadn't dreamed of before. That we're going to be able to get customers way more involved in being a part of the solution. And the only other thing I was going to say is, based on the Carolinas, we have a very small RPS in North Carolina. We do not have one in South Carolina, and the net zero goals mentioned by the utilities are voluntary in that sense. But I do want to say I think there's a lot of pressure in the financial sector, the insurance markets, that are going to help kind of steer us anyway toward having to choose clean energy. I think ESG investment is something that Duke Energy has taken seriously, starting with 2019 with their report. And I just wanted to kind of put that on as another layer in terms of what the regulatory structures are. I think market and investment forces are also going to kind of bring utilities, to the same direction. That's different than the wholesale discussion, but I just wanted to kind of layer that on top of it. So thanks.
Let me. We're gonna move to audience questions here in a few minutes, and I have seen. Let me apologize. I've seen a couple questions pop up. I'm working from my phone this morning due to technology challenges. Please post your questions to the everyone chat if I haven't responded to you, which I haven't because I can't get to it. But before we do that, I want to actually, Emily, Phil, I'm gonna give you the microphone, but I'm going to tee you up with a question, and then you can respond if you want to, or respond to what else you've heard on the panel. Emily's with Duke Energy, is one of their clean energy gurus, who's I've had the privilege of working with for a long time. So, Emily, one of the things that I think is interesting, it's an opportunity, it's also a challenge right now in the Carolinas, is we don't really have a policy umbrella to drive what comes next, and so we're having this debate before the utility commissions. We're having it without a ton of guidance from the state legislatures. I know there are negotiations underway in North Carolina, and so maybe we'll see the paradigm shift up there. But we're in this interim period where important decisions are being made. They're being made without a very prescriptive policy umbrella. How do you think about our situation and what comes next?
Thanks, Hamilton. And for those of you on the line, I didn't prep on this question, so I'm going to just take a deep breath and think about it. When I think about our discussion just now about the 3 R's, retire, replace, and then recover investments, whether you're a utility or whether you're a solar developer or somebody who builds natural gas plants. You put a whole lot of capital into the ground and you recover that investment through contractual means or through rates. or through a market, or some combination of those three. When I think about this energy conversation, and then when I think about the South Carolina General Assembly and legislators, I remind myself that even though I'm a self-proclaimed energy nerd and I love talking about resource economics, Hamilton does too, and these regulatory mechanisms, the bigger picture here is one of communities and resilience and how we use our resources in South Carolina over the long term. And so when I think about the need for maybe a larger policy than just, or actually a subsequent policy to the Energy Freedom Act that really provides the burrito wrapper, so to speak, for Act 236, the Energy Freedom Act, and kind of ties them all together and helps us understand where we're going to go for the next 10 or 20 years. I remind myself that not all members of the General Assembly think about energy or markets on a day-to-day basis. They may be thinking about flood control. They may be thinking about conservation or a state park or a recreation area. They may be thinking about whether or not infrastructure should go through an ecologically sensitive area. So in our conversations about what comes next here, I think we've got to actually think beyond just energy economics and think about those larger themes about where the infrastructure is, what ecosystem services, not to get too wonky on you, but what water and land and air are we going to use to enable this infrastructure to go in? And so sometimes those are land use questions. Sometimes those are which land is used. So I think it's worth talking about what are the larger themes out there that may be more germane to the individual communities in each county in South Carolina that are impactful to customers, and bring it home and see if we can combine future energy policy with something that resonates with individual customers. Thad's company does a fantastic job of doing that by putting that energy decision in the customer's hands, by really giving them that sense of ownership and control. But beyond that, what else can we do? I'm going to pause because I'm hearing myself talk to myself. But Hamilton, I just suggest that we all think about, what's the bigger picture here? Is it the changing climate? Is it resilient communities? Is it flood control? Is it increasing the health of the land in the state through conservation? And then how can our energy decisions resonate with those larger themes?
Yeah, well, it's definitely, there's a bigger picture here that we can't lose sight of for sure. And those are good points to include in this conversation. Let me.
This is Bonnie. Yeah. I can't resist the urge to chime in here. I appreciate it. And Emily, in particular, to the point that you just made, you, I'm sure, are following, as am I, the creation in South Carolina of an Office of State Resilience and the appointment of Ben Duncan, who was previously with Department of Insurance, to the directorship of that office. And I agree with you, Emily. I think resilience is the framework that perhaps pulls this together. And I am really hopeful that the creation of that Office of State Resilience will give us another forum, a different forum to have some policy related conversation around how energy fits into a lot of the other challenging conversations from a resilience perspective that our state has. Thanks for the opportunity to offer that thought, Hamilton.
Of course, hop in whenever.
Hamilton, can I piggyback there and just, I want to say one thing about the resilience issue. There is a stakeholder group that will be starting probably later this year. It's climate risk and resilience. It's part of a settlement between Vote Solar and Duke Energy, Carolinas in Progress in North Carolina. I think this is going to be an opportunity to tie in some of the, you were about to go to the transmission, to tie in how grid planning is responsive to the challenges of climate change. And I think there's also a broader conversation to be had about the IRP and how, you know, the resource mix also takes into account things like drought. And I mean, we're kind of facing a little bit of drought conditions in North Carolina right now. So I would just say that's going to be a really interesting process that ties into the grid planning, and I think ultimately going to tie into resource planning.
Great, thanks, Dad. Yeah, so I was going to take us to transmission, and I still will if we don't get questions from our audience. But I do want to pause and see if anyone wants to ask a question on the chat box or turn your video on and interact with our panelists. Please feel free to do that now. Maybe Jessica and Bonnie, y'all can help me make sure that that happens.
Certainly will, Hamilton. I appreciate the challenges of participating by a handheld device as opposed to a computer. I also wanted to let everyone know that we are going to keep this platform open for 30 minutes beyond the closing time of the presentation. We've decided to leave it open until 1:30 just to allow for additional networking and questions and conversation. If we run into the 1 o'clock hour, know that we will keep the platform open. Not everyone who is participating has committed to being with us past 1 o'clock, but we do appreciate those who are still with us. And at this time, I'm checking the chat. Hamilton, I don't see any questions other than ones that I do think were sent to you and Josh. And so Josh maybe a little, and Jessica received them in the Q&A box. I'm going to open that up. As host, Jessica could see some things that I wasn't able to see. So I don't know if Josh is available and able to tell us if y'all have addressed that question that was sent to you or not, but
we do have one that just popped up in the chat box as well. Yeah, well, Josh, go ahead if you've got.
No, I'm trying to locate the question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, why don't we take the one that just showed up in the chat box, which is a good one, and something we certainly wanted to get to as part of this. There've been some talk of affordability, but maybe not specifically as it relates to low and middle income customers. And Howard Smith asked how the commission deal with crossover cost issues for those customers, especially when they can't afford renewables or storage themselves. So Eddie, I'm going to pitch that to you to start with.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think, first of all, I'll say in the big picture, the things that we've been talking about here, how to make the whole system run more efficiently and take advantage of new technology, that's inherently a cost reduction discussion. And furthermore, if you never tackle that and never succeed at it, then all of those low income customers are disadvantaged. So like, this is the work we need to do to help them. And rather than, for instance, I'm not saying this is mutually exclusive, but if you tackle the problem as customer by customer, you're never going to help all of them. But if you lower utility costs through a smart decision, you're going to help everybody. So that's part of what we're talking about. But you referenced crossover costs, which I think I know what you're saying there. And in this recent Duke settlement, it opens the door for those net metering customers for them to lower peak usage on winter mornings in such a way that the net benefit to the whole system is positive. So in other words, they're not being subsidized. They have the opportunity to subsidize others. And this is the first step towards a more general policy that can involve customers in bringing value to the system. So first, I think part of the assumption in that question may be that you have to be the adopter in order to benefit. And part of what I'm saying is there are going to be early adopters. There's going to be new technology, and we're trying to leverage that to benefit everyone. And then, finally, I'll touch on two other things that I think have to be a partner with generation planning and distributed generation planning. And all of our utilities are aware of this and are working on it, but it's the efficiency services to low-income customers. It's even utility companies that have good energy efficiency programs. It's a challenge to make it so that those programs similarly serve the low-income customers at a level that is, reflects what other customers are getting for what they pay for. So I think that's a piece of it. And then, we've seen some data within Dominion, for instance, and also from Lawrence Berkeley Labs, that the solar penetration among moderate income customers, not the lowest income customers, but it's higher than you would think, and in some cases higher than the general population. And that goes back to South Carolina's decision to allow leasing. And also, there's a variation in solar installation costs around the country, but I think when you have a climate in which people use a lot of electricity, then the benefit to individuals of shifting to distributed generation can be large enough to benefit middle income customers too. And if you think about it, think about New Mexico, for instance, which for decades has had the lowest electric bill on a monthly basis. And they probably pay $85 a month on average. We pay more like $140. And so even those low income customers are already paying a lot for energy. That means that they have the capability to shift some of that money, not to add to it, but to shift it into other technologies. And we've seen that happen some in South Carolina. So I think there are a set of assumptions in the question that, if you examine it, are not as reflective of reality as you might assume going in, and that we are trying to tackle that issue of services to low and moderate income customers.
Hamilton, can I jump on just really briefly?
For sure.
Okay, I was just going to say, I think answering Howard's question, first of all, like, if we're talking about solar plus storage programs, I think they're best and sustainable if they're designed to be cost effective. And I think you really can find that. You can make that happen if you're delivering value streams that, just currently aren't available. That's kind of like we said, if we put all the gadgets on the grid, but if we don't have a way to use them. So we have to develop policies that utilize what storage and solar can do together. So that's one. But second, I think we have to be very intentional in policy design to make sure that we're expanding access. I mean, one of the easy applications you could see is for folks that are, vulnerable communities that have the need for medical devices that are powered by electricity, solar plus storage being prioritized for customers like that, or creating resilience hubs in communities where folks that have those needs and have medication that needs to be refrigerated can go when there's going to be a prolonged outage after a hurricane, for example. I think these are things that really do need to be intentional when we're making policy about solar and storage. So that's not a cure-all. Eventually, the market needs to step in and be able to say, this is a service we can provide that's of value to you. And I think everyone wants resilience. So this is an exciting topic, and I think we can't do it justice in 2 minutes. But thanks to Howard for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I'll just point out too, just maybe dovetailing with what some of Eddie expressed. Duke shifted in North Carolina to a competitive procurement program for new solar resources a few years ago, and has touted widely cost savings that came along with that shift, in how they were adding solar to their system. And so you're seeing savings I think it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, from that type of program for adding clean energy to the grid, which are savings that get passed along to all customers. And so, while it can be more challenging at the customer level sometimes to take advantage of resources that are still emerging and becoming competitive, at the utility scale, large scale, those savings do flow down to all of the utility customers. Josh, I see you off of mute. Did you locate your question, or do you have anything you want to add here?
No, yes, I did. Thanks to Jessica for the help with me finding it. There was a question about a specific fossil asset in South Carolina, asking if anyone had considered replacing this fossil asset with a mix of solar storage and distributed energy and demand response, and if so, at what cost? Personally, no, I have not. I haven't done any modeling in the South Carolina market, although I think that it's fair to say that I believe it's something like 1.2 gigawatts that was on the table in the question. I mean, it would certainly be a mixture of a variety of assets to replace that kind of capacity and energy supply, and it would have to be a mixture between solar storage, etc. There would be a solid portion of this, the capacity need, that could be reduced through optimization on the demand side. So demand side interventions, which would be appliances, etc. But no, I haven't specifically, and I would actually kind of maybe redirect this to Hamilton, who I think has a better working knowledge of generators and assets in South Carolina than I do.
Yeah, I don't know. There may be a reference to either Winyah, which Santee Cooper
It
owns, and
is Winyah.
Yeah, so I think we're about to have that discussion right now. Santee Cooper has proposed to replace that capacity, not one for one, but I think about a half of that capacity with a combined cycle unit. There's the process for doing that has not yet started. The legislature is still working on reform legislation that would address how Santee Cooper does go about planning for replacing that generation. And so this is really an interesting near-term test case for, and especially with Santee Cooper too, which is a state-owned utility, doesn't have shareholders, doesn't have the same type of stake in ownership, where we're about to find out what type of analysis is needed to determine what role clean energy plays in replacing that type of capacity when it comes offline. So stay tuned on that front. I will predict that there are clean energy solutions that are cost effective and reliable, and that's where we'll land. But we got a little ways to go between here and there.
Hamilton, on that, is it Santee? Is it Central? Who's is it Santee and Dominion that are proposing to co-invest?
I think right now, yeah, the combined cycle unit would be shared by Dominion and Santee. The capacity from a new unit is my current understanding. Though again, that's not been formally proposed, so some of that speculation.
The only reason I say that, I think it's unlawful, or there's some weird. I think there's some weird in Santee's Enabling Act that they were granted the ability to own part of a nuclear unit in Fairfield County, but they are actually barred without seeking legislative approval from building any generating facility. It's weird. There's some provision in there, and so that's why I was kind of wondering. Obviously, Hamilton, I think there's probably more cost-efficient ways to do it. I think, I think the prospect of building a combined cycle gas plant, Santee and Dominion going in on that, is not very, very good, and I think that's a stranded asset in the making. And again, as an end user of a co-op, that we would certainly be encouraging our co-ops not to participate in that.
Well, it's going to be a good test case, Jamie. So I'm glad Google's voice will be part of that for sure. We've got just a few more minutes before we hit 1 o'clock. I've not seen any additional questions pop up. Any quick, just closing thoughts from the panelists before we head into overtime?
Yeah, I can offer just some thoughts. I mean, thanks for the platform to have the conversation. I think, just I try to as best think about the things that have to be true and not necessarily worry about the mechanisms that get us there. It seems that, one thing that is true is that there's a growing number of interdependencies between the two states' energy systems. Obviously, this is going to create a whole bunch of new fun challenges that are physical, but also, red tape, jurisdictional issues, for example. If we didn't really have a chance to get into, the ramifications of a study bill, and how it how it should consider which state utility commission has authority under which alternative or which result or which study or any of these things. But these are problems that the parties involved will certainly have to take up and consider. But other than that, I just wanted to say thanks everyone for the time today. And if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk anytime.
Yeah, well, thanks for those thoughts, Josh, and yeah, thanks to the panelists for sharing their Friday midday with everyone. It's certainly a pleasure for me to get to talk to all these folks all in one spot. I work with most of these guys on a regular basis, and these are the all-stars of the energy policy discussion in the Carolinas right now. So it's great having them in one place. And Bonnie, thanks to you and E4 for making this happen.